Hello everyone and welcome back to a brand new video from me, Pickles Parker Reviews. Now today I'm going to be reviewing the Doctor Who Big Finish story, simply titled Davros, starring Colin Baker as the 6th Doctor and Terry Malloy, conveniently, as Davros. Now Davros was a story I first listened to around the beginning or the early stages, shall we say, of 2019. I actually recorded a review for it and I was going to put it up. I mentioned this in my We Are the Daleks review, but this video, the Davros one specifically, I actually fully edited, and it was actually privated on my channel for ages. It still is, and I never actually released it, mainly because at that time I took a break from making Doctor Who videos, and what I was going to do was have a triumphant return with a video called Why You Should Watch Doctor Who. Obviously I never made that video and I'm not going to make it now because I don't think I can genuinely recommend Doctor Who to anyone because of the Timeless Children. I'm joking. Guys, I'm joking, I swear.
Has been annoyed.
I was going to have a triumphant return due to my lack of Doctor Who videos since my resolution review, and that was going to be the one. And then I was going to follow up with some more general Doctor Who videos like this Davros review. But that was the main video I wanted to return to. And obviously I never made that video. And I never actually made any Doctor Who videos in 2019. This big triumphant return never happened. Hence that Doctor Who Davros video was never released. However, obviously now getting back into Big Finish, I wanted to re-review this. And obviously re-reviewing it made me re-listen to it, obviously, because I couldn't remember a story that I listened to in like 2019. I had to re-listen to it, and I'm really glad I did, because Davros is a really brilliant story. Now, in terms of the character of Davros, I like Davros. I think everyone likes Davros, but I was having a think, and when you really think about it, Davros isn't really used well in many stories. I wouldn't say not used well, but he's not really got his full potential out of in most of his appearances. I think why Genesis is held up as such a brilliant story, one of the reasons is obviously Davros. And the thing is, in Genesis, because it's Davros's, well, it's his origin story, his Genesis, if you will, this is the first appearance of Davros. And what works so well is you really see the intricacies of the character. Michael Wisher gives such a good performance. But a lot of the stuff, it's all on the page, really. All the stuff about Davros, his mental scarring and his, his physical condition, his mad ideas with his rage and obviously his fascism, yet his quieter moments. But mainly, he has all his scientists there, all his considered friends, and when they start turning on him, him going to the Khalid bunker, you can see how much the war means to him. He's been brought up on it. You've obviously got the scene where the Doctor says, if you had a virus, would you wipe it out? And he says, yes, I would. To have that power, it would set me up above the gods. Such a good scene. In that, you really get a sense of Davros. It's not just the maniacal shouty moments. I think what's so good in that are the quieter Davros moments. Are his conversations with the Doctor, his conversations with Nyder. Even the bit at the end where he says, your heart had a slight notch that didn't work. I fixed that. I mended your heart. Now you're going to turn that heart against me. It's just so good. You really get a great sense of Davros as a character. However, when you really think of it, outside of Genesis of the Daleks, you don't really ever really explore Davros as a character in the main show quite like that. He obviously makes great appearances. I think Revelation of the Daleks is such a good Davros story, mainly because it focuses on Davros more so than the Daleks. Really, it should be Revelation of Davros, even though that wouldn't be such a good title, but there you go, because it's mainly a Davros story. However, I think you just look at these stories, and even Revelation, it's got Davros in it, but it's not really about him. It's more of Davros in a situation, and that's mainly all the other Dalek stories. In the 80s, it explores the idea of the Daleks seeing Davros as impure, so he creates Daleks that are loyal to him, and that's an interesting idea, flipping the Daleks' racial purity on its head and almost having the Daleks and Davros at bitter ends with each other. That's interesting. But in terms of Davros as a character and his core beliefs, you never really got that outside of Genesis of the Daleks. And obviously in Magician's Apprentice, Witches of Familiar, fast forward from like 1986 all the way to 2015, they did try to do that. But again, it didn't really work. That wasn't really executed too well. And I think the annoying thing about the Magician's Apprentice, which is familiar, is the fact that they really tried to unlock Davros, but it didn't really work. It was kind of poorly executed. However, if you're looking for a better version of Magician's Apprentice, which is familiar, that was actually made years before it, I'd be looking at Davros, because, as I've been alluding to here, you know, none of the stories outside of Genesis really try and analyse Davros as a character, yet that's the core basis of Davros. I mean, you'd think so. The story's literally called Davros. That's exactly what this tries to do. Essentially, the setup is that Davros's body is found by the owner of a corporation and his wife. Essentially, this is a future where corporations run everything. There's this corporation run by this guy called Baines, which essentially owns everything. You know, they make all the goods, essentially. Everything you get is from this corporation, so they essentially have all this power. You've got this massive dome with all these workers working in there, living in there, essentially. And what he wants to do is try and get Davros to combat some of his problems, such as, you know, all these tech problems, you know, population, starvation, all this sorts of stuff. He wants Davros for his mind. However, his wife is a bit of a Nazi sympathiser, but obviously take that and imprint it onto the Daleks and Davros. And wants to write the biography of Davros and just essentially loves this man. And the Doctor kind of gets wrapped up in this story kind of coincidentally. Now, this corporation has been doing shady things, rumours of it letting go all its miners, and obviously the miners give people lots of jobs. So there's this reporter here who's got the inside scoop from a corporation employee. He tries to get the Doctor, so the Doctor's there, and the Doctor's kind of a bit unsure. He's like, yeah, this is bad, but it's just basic capitalism. It's not really, you know, his kind of shtick. But then obviously he sees that Davros is there and tries to intervene, and what ends up happening is Mr. Baines, the corporation owner, gets the Doctor and Davros to try and work together to combat these problems rather than just Davros himself. And you see that Davros really tries to change. He really tries to reform, and obviously at the end, you know, this is with the Sixth Doctor, you know that doesn't happen. But it's interesting, it's not a whole thing like Magician's Apprentice, which is familiar, where you seem like Davros is showing a different side, and it's like, psych, he was bad the whole time. He was just tricking you. No, not in this one. He really tries to reform, and then just at the end, he can't, because that's just the person he is. He can't change, because he is Davros. He can only see the world in one way. You know, as he says back on Skaro, it was a war. He didn't have, you know, the population problem, because everyone was dying in the war. All this sorts of stuff, you know, he didn't have all this technology, all these corporations. He couldn't deal with these problems. All he knew was war. You know, you had the figures in power, the women making the children. You've got the men going off to fight. This is all he knew. And he can't deal with this society as much as he tries. And he really does try in this story. You see a different side to Davros. And I wouldn't say you feel sorry for him, but it really opens up a completely new leaf on Davros. I love the scene where he says to the Doctor, "You're the closest I have to a friend." And it really makes you think. And you're like, yeah, actually, you're 100% right. You know, when you think about it, the Doctor and Davros have combated each other so many times that it kind of makes sense that they'd have this sort of relationship. Davros would see them as equals. They're both scientists, men who have, you know, escaped death countless times, been around in thousands of generations. You know, they're in generations way outside when they were originally, you know, born and around. You know, they're in times that don't really suit them. Time-hopping characters who their planets are gone, and they're not exactly favourable with their people. With Davros, it's obviously he's not favourable with his own creations. With the Doctor, it's the Time Lords. You really see that kind of linkage there, and that kind of familiarity between the two, and their similarities, which was something interesting, because it's not something you always associate. I think when people ask what's the Doctor's biggest enemy, usually say the Daleks or the Cybermen, or if you're talking like not monster but one like main rival, you'd say the Master, wouldn't you? But I think it's really interesting that this tries to portray that it's actually Davros who is the Doctor's equal, his rival. And that's really interesting, because when you think about it, there's a lot of similarities there, and I like the fact that not only Davros references this, but it also does a great deal to flesh him out. The Davros has a great deal of respect for the Doctor, and when you boil it down to it, the Doctor has a little bit of respect there for Davros. That's quite interesting. And the scenes of them walking together, yes, the Doctor does try and irritate Davros quite a lot. He is constantly telling people not to trust Davros, which is obviously he's right to, but I think it's just really interesting. You see Davros, you know, sit down with Bane's wife, you know, talk to the Doctor, talk to Bane's, really trying to figure out these solutions, and he does do some good. He's really trying to look up on his past and really trying to change and turn over a new leaf. There's a great scene where Davros talks about being in suspended animation for so long that he looked upon his destruction and was horrified and realised that he wanted a second chance. It's brilliant. However, the problem is, as I mentioned before, is that Davros isn't used to this world. We see the world he's used to through the use of flashbacks, which are really interesting actually. It's really interesting to see, you know, what Skara was like during the war, pre-genesis of the Daleks, but it's actually really interesting to see Davros pre his injuries while he was just normal. You see a young Davros with, you know, someone else. You see Davros begin a fascination with some fellow scientist who's a female who ultimately betrays and executes in typical Davros fashion. Yeah, it's really interesting to see this this curtain, you know, unveiled on Davros' younger years, and it's really interesting. If I had one criticism with the flashbacks, it would be that at first it's quite difficult to understand what's a flashback and what's part of the main story, purely down to the fact that it's audio and there's not always a distinct cut in between. Often what they'll do in this audio is almost try and like make you think it's part of the actual main story, and then you realise it's a flashback, you know, kind of linking the two scenes between the two different eras. And while that's interesting, it doesn't really work on audio initially. I mean, I'm fine with the flashbacks later on as they get more obvious because you get younger with Davros as it goes on. I think so. I think there's one scene there where he's like really young and then he ages, but all pre his injuries obviously. But obviously later on you understand what's a flashback and what's not, but certainly initially when you're not used to it, it is a bit difficult to understand purely because it's on audio. But I do like the idea of the flashbacks, it's interesting. And yeah, I just like how this really deconstructs Davros, and ultimately he realizes that he just flips a switch. He tries to reform and he realizes he can't, and when he fixes the problem of, you know, the stock market and capitalism and these corporations and trying to take them down by essentially realizing and making the equation for the stock market so you could calculate a success every single time, and also if you gave that to someone then that would be capitalism. But he does it to try and take down capitalism, you think, and he tries to give it to the journalist who the Doctor is working with, but then you realise that actually he wants to release it to everyone, so then it would just be hell. Everyone would know everything, and that would be the downfall of society. You know, as much as the capitalist society isn't good, what Davros is suggesting is much worse and just wouldn't work. And the reason he wants to do this is then he'd have the power. You know, everyone would have this, but he'd have the power. He'd start wars, then he, you know, essentially install a fascist dictatorship and create a massive war. Because that's all he knows. He tries to combat these problems, but he just can't. He tries to change, but he just can't. This is all he knows. And then at the end, he realises that actually this is what he wants to do with this world, because he tried to change and he can't, and he falls back on his fundamental belief about the world, which is trying to start a massive war. Harry Malloy is so good. I feel like he's a really underrated Davros. Everyone talks about Michael Wisher. I mean, I even did in this review in Genesis, but Terry Malloy is so good as Davros. He is amazing, and particularly in this story, he's really put a case for my favourite Davros in this story. He is amazing in this. I'm pretty sure they got him to do the younger Davros sections as well, and he's really good in that as well. He just knows Davros, he just communicates it so well. And as I said, you've not just got the ranty Davros there, you've got the calm Davros, and the Davros, like, it's to do with the writing, but also Malloy's performance that almost makes you feel sorry for Davros as well. And in a way, this story is so good. It's called Davros, obviously because it's a character piece focusing on Davros, and it couldn't do a better job at that. It is so good at doing that, and obviously it's made me more fascinated with the character of Davros. It's what the Magician's Apprentice, which is familiar, tried to do, and in my opinion failed to do. But this just does it so well. If you love Davros and you're looking for a character piece on Davros, pick this up, listen to it, because it's such a good in-depth dive into Davros, and it's really made me appreciate his character so much more. I mean, I already liked him but this just brings it to another level. Colin Baker as well is in this story. I don't think I've reviewed a 6th Doctor Big Finish audio on my channel. I've listened to a few, but this is the first one I'm reviewing on this channel. And he's great, Colin Baker. I don't mind him on the show. I mean, obviously a lot of people don't like Colin Baker. I don't mind him on the show, but obviously, you know, there are flaws with his Doctor. I'm not going to ignore them. However, in this, he's near perfection, honestly. I think you can see the dedication Colin Baker has and the enthusiasm he has for the role. He always had that. But often, the writing just wasn't always the best. But here, they've really pinned down what makes his Doctor so fantastic. He still has, you know, his pompous nature, but it is toned down. You know, he does come across as friendly. You know, he can have good conversations with people, but he also still has what made his Doctor so great. That almost on-edgeness of his Doctor. But also, as I said, you know, he has the pompous nature, but he also has his friendly moments. He is very funny in this story as well, is what I thought. He is actually quite hilarious. And Colin Baker, I don't know whether it's just me, but his acting has improved so much. I'm not saying he was bad at acting on the show. Speech to the Time Lords in Trial of a Time Lord, you guys know the one I'm talking about, the Power Mad Conspirators one. That is great, but obviously his acting on the show, even though Colin Baker put his heart and soul into it, it wasn't always the best. But here, you think he was a seasoned, like, a professional. He is so good in this. He's honestly perfect in this story, Colin Baker. I don't know what it is. It's a combination of Baker, it's a combination of the writing, but his Doctor is perfect. He brilliantly suits this story. He doesn't put a foot wrong, and Colin Baker is so good with Terry Malloy's Davros. You think they you know, shared many stories on screen. You won't think it was just the one. The way they're interacting with each other in this story, it's so good. Colin Baker's Doctor suits this story to the ground, suits Davros and Terry Malloy's Davros to the ground, and he's really good. He's really engaging in the story as well. I don't know, Colin Baker was just amazing in this story. I really enjoyed it, and I think if we just saw this version of the Colin Baker on TV, you'd honestly be up there with one of my favourite Doctors, because he's so good in this. And it really makes me, like with Sylvester McCoy, but even more so here, it really makes me want to see more of Colin Baker on Big Finish, because he's brilliant. He is so good in this, and it just really makes you think of what could have been. One of the things that this story does also do that The Magician's Apprentice Witches Familiar kind of failed to do, is that it actually creates a really compelling story around the character piece stuff. In Magician's Apprentice Witches Familiar, I mean, it's chock-a-block with stuff, but none of the story strands really come together. You've got Missy and Clara, but that doesn't really go anywhere. You've got Daleks, but they don't really do much. The main thing is the Doctor and Davros. Whereas in this, the main thing is the Doctor and Davros, obviously it's called Davros, but you've actually got a really interesting story and a really interesting world building there around the corporation, as I mentioned before. I think it's the TIC Corporation. There's really interesting stuff there about capitalism and, you know, the bad things about capitalism, you know. I'm not going to say the benefits of capitalism, because this story certainly doesn't do that, but almost looking at, you know, capitalism, but what could be worse, which is what Davros obviously suggests. And yeah, it's just really interesting. You see all this stuff. You've got characters in here that aren't particularly likeable. You aren't particularly rooting for them, but they end up being the characters that I'm not going to say you're forced to root for them, but that you'll follow throughout the story. Other than the Doctor and a couple of others, the characters in this story aren't very nice. It's quite a bleak story. Only one supporting character other than the Doctor, and I guess Davros, because although he does quote-unquote die at the end of this story, even the Doctor remarks at this that he's sure he'll be back. So only one supporting character survives this story, just showing how brutal it is. You've got all the other characters die in pretty horrific ways. You've got the journalist, who isn't even killed by Davros. There's a big bomb there underneath in the mines. Bane's the Doctor and the journalist. And ultimately what happens is that the bomb doesn't kill them. They're walking around, you know, these dark caves trying to get out. You know, there's a sheer drop, and you think Baines has learnt his lesson. You think he might actually work with the journalist now, even though they've had their differences across the story. And what happens? He just realises that, you know, no one's going to find his body. They'll just realise he was killed in the explosion, and no one's going to hear his story and hear the truth. So he just flat out kills the journalist and pushes him off a sheer drop. Yeah, it's pretty bleak, this story. Davros isn't the only monster in this story. You've got Baines, as I mentioned, the ruthless and cold-hearted corporation owner. You've got his wife, Mrs. Baines, who is almost a Nazi sympathiser, and it's a really great development to see her as a Nazi sympathiser talking absolute waffle about Davros and almost idolising him, and then realising that actually while she idolised him in the history books, seeing it in the flesh and his ideologies really isn't nice. This story is just really bleak. It's got some great ideas in there about, you know, what can be redeemed, what redeems you, can you be redeemed, you know, stuff about Nazis and Nazi sympathisers and capitalism and the character of Davros, obviously. It's a really interesting story, I think, and yeah, I just thoroughly enjoyed listening to it. It's one of the longest Big Finish stories I've listened to. It's 2 hours and a half. Which is obviously longer than the usual 2-hour monthly range play, but I didn't get bored at all. I really enjoyed this story. As I said before, it's a really good story, and it's probably my favourite Big Finish story I listened to. It's just so rich with themes and ideas and, you know, a character study on Davros, but also the world. There's so much good world building here that you can really visualise it. Colin Baker is brilliant, the characters are unlikable but really well developed. Ultimately, I really enjoyed Davros. I think you look at it and you just think, oh, it's just the character story on Davros. Probably, you know, a bit fillery. They just thought, oh, Davros, let's just mock up a random Davros story. But no, it is so good. It explores Davros in such a good way. Oh my god, the stuff they do with Davros is brilliant. And also the world is great, Colin Baker is great, the themes are great. It's an amazing story. It is my favourite Big Finish story I've listened to. Honestly, I really, really enjoyed Davros. So yes, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, drop us a comment, hit that notification bell to stay notified for all my latest videos. I hope you enjoyed this video, this review of Davros. In terms of my next review, I'll probably be reviewing the Juggernauts, which is obviously the other Big Finish story I was going to review in 2019 but never released. This one is kind of similar to this actually. It's obviously got Davros in it, it's got the 6th Doctor, but it's also got the Daleks, and also he's got Mel with him, so we've got a return of Mel, who I obviously reviewed in my last review with the Daleks, not the 6th Doctor, on his own. And I forgot to mention this actually in my main review, but Colin Baker is great in this, as I said, but it's great that he doesn't have a companion actually, because it really works well just seeing the Doctor in this world, you know, having to meet new people, make allies, you know, and you just get pure 6th Doctor in this, which I like, and it almost explores, you know, a way that almost Davros is the Doctor's companion in a weird way. That's really nice as well, and that's really great as well. And I just think we should have more stories with the Doctor companion in this actually, because you obviously have great stories like Deadly Assassin, Waters of Mars, and I just think it would be great to see more stories with the Doctor without a companion, because this story really sees its strengths. But obviously in the next review of the Juggernauts, he's with Mel, so we'll see how that differs and how we see almost another encounter with the Doctor and Davros, with this Doctor and Davros, with a companion, with the Daleks, with a completely different setting. So obviously join me next week when I review the Juggernauts. Yes, thank you guys for watching. What do you think of Davros? Do you like it? Do you not? Drop your thoughts in the comment section below, and drop your thoughts about Davros as a character and what your favourite Davros story is, because I'm really interested to hear that as well. But thank you guys for watching, and of course, a goodbye.